When Russia signals that silver belongs inside state reserves, it's not a hobby, not symbolism, and not a fun diversification trade. It's a structural confession that the monetary era you grew up in is ending. Here's the claim most people will miss. Silver entering a sovereign reserve framework is what happens when a system stops trusting paper settlement and starts preparing for physical settlement. Not someday. Now, this is not accidental. It's the predictable outcome of a repeatable multi-step pattern that has shown up across empires, standards, and currency regimes for centuries. Authority check. The world is running on debt and promises at a scale that can only survive with uninterrupted confidence. Global debt has been reported at record levels in the hundreds of trillions of dollars, while sovereign liabilities keep rolling forward instead of being retired. And when debt becomes permanent refinancing, the system becomes mathematically fragile. One credibility shock, one settlement fracture, and suddenly everyone wants collateral, not contracts. That's why the silver signal matters. It's not about Russia liking silver. It's about Russia building escape routes from a settlement system that already proved it can freeze, block, and reclassify reserves. Because once reserves can be immobilized by politics, reserves stop being neutral savings. They become conditional permissions. And conditional permissions are not reserves, they are risk. So the inevitability statement is simple. When neutrality breaks, reserve rules expand from paper to metal, from gold only to multi-asset hard collateral. That is the next phase, and the math makes it inevitable. Here is the mechanism. 4 stages, same order. Always. Stage 1 is the setup. A dominant settlement center establishes credibility so strong that everyone treats its promises as money. Trade grows because trust lowers friction, and holding the center's assets feels safer than holding your own. Stage 2 is expansion and overextension. The center issues more claims than it can comfortably honor under stress. Debt climbs faster than real output, external obligations multiply, and the system survives because confidence keeps rolling liabilities forward. Stage 3 is crisis and loss of control. A trigger hits, and the world discovers the settlement system isn't neutral. Assets can be frozen, repriced, defaulted on, or inflated away, and people shift from holding claims to demanding anchors. Stage 4 is the outcome. Reserves reconfigure. Gold moves first because it is the oldest exit hatch. Then comes the second layer, silver and strategic hard collateral, because the new era is not only monetary, it's industrial and geopolitical. If you understand those 4 stages, you can predict behavior better than most analysts who stare at charts all day. Now we prove it with history, not vibes. First case study, China's silver-based monetary reality in the early 20th century. For long stretches, silver wasn't a trade for China. It was the bloodstream of pricing and settlement. Stage 1, there was stability through the anchor. When money is tied to a metal, domestic prices become linked to that metal's global value, and discipline feels automatic. Stage 2 arrived when the external environment changed faster than the internal system could adapt. The Great Depression era became a policy war, and major powers started absorbing and manipulating silver flows. When the outside price and policy pull strengthened, the anchor turned into a magnet. Silver began leaving China because it was worth more outside, and that is the mechanical horror of a metal-linked system. Your money can get exported. Stage 3 was the loss of control. Monetary contraction hits when the metal drains, deflation pressure rises, hoarding intensifies, and confidence collapses because people see the anchor disappearing in real time. Stage 4 followed with the only move states make when survival is on the line. Abandon purity and redesign the framework. The lesson is not silver failed. The lesson is that the environment forced a reserve reset. Second case study, Britain and the gold standard collapse. Britain sat at the center of global finance and treated gold discipline as the credibility engine of the pound. Stage 1 was obvious. The world trusted London. British claims cleared trade, the system expanded, and the anchor looked unbreakable. Stage 2 came through overextension and obligations. War finance, imperial commitments, and post-war debts built a structure that required constant confidence to stay stable. Stage 3 hit when maintaining old parity demanded pain. Capital pressure, competitiveness, strain, and international stress exposed the truth. A redemption rule is only permanent until it threatens political survival. Britain left gold in 1931, and that moment wasn't random. It was the pattern. Stage 4 followed with managed currencies, blocks, controls, and a gradual shift in leadership. Again, the lesson isn't gold is bad. The lesson is that overextension makes single anchor regimes fragile. Third case study, Bretton Woods to Nixon. This is the template modern people reference, but most still miss the mechanism. Stage 1 was the post-war credibility anchor. The dollar was linked to gold for official holders, and the world tied currencies to the dollar. Trade scaled because settlement liquidity expanded. Stage 2 was the trap. The system required the U.S. to supply dollars to the world, which meant issuing liabilities. As trade grew, dollar claims grew, while fiscal and geopolitical burdens rose. Promises expanded faster than the gold anchor could credibly redeem under stress. Stage 3 arrived as holders tested the anchor and the U.S. faced the reality that redemption would drain metal and control. In 1971, the gold window closed. A permanent rule became a policy choice. Stage 4 created a new reserve regime, not gold redemption, but power, depth, and managed credibility. The system survived, but the nature of backing changed. Now take that same 4-stage pattern and apply it to today, step by step, without emotion. Stage 1 today was the belief that reserves held in the dominant financial system were apolitical and safe. Keep assets in major currencies, store them in custodial infrastructures, assume neutral property rights. Then the trigger arrived. A major sovereign's external reserves were immobilized by political decision. Whatever your opinion, the mechanism is the point. Reserves were treated as leverage. Check. Stage 2, today, is the global debt and refinancing machine. Debt is high enough that the system depends on uninterrupted market functioning, continuous liquidity, and rolling confidence. At the same time, trade is fragmenting. Supply chains are being securitized. Industrial inputs are treated as strategic. The world is moving from efficiency to resilience, which is just a polite word for controlled scarcity, verified. Stage 3. Today is the credibility fracture. Once reserves can be frozen, every central bank and treasury has to ask a brutal question. Are my reserves money, or are they someone else's permission? When that question spreads, behavior changes. Diversification accelerates. Demand for custody at home rises. Physical assets become attractive, not because they moon, but because they cannot be clicked off. Undeniable. Now, stage 4 is the outcome, and this is where silver enters like a quiet alarm bell. Gold is the obvious first anchor. It is universally recognized, historically monetary, and politically symbolic. But gold alone solves only one problem: monetary sovereignty. Silver solves two problems at once. It is monetary, yes, but it is also industrial. It sits at the junction of money and manufacturing, finance, and physical supply. In a fractured world, the reserve function splits into two jobs. Job 1 is monetary defense, an asset that sits outside the liability chain of rivals. Job 2 is industrial defense, an asset that can be converted into inputs, leverage, or trade concessions when supply lines tighten. Gold is perfect for Job 1. Silver is unusually useful for Job 2, while still retaining Job 1 characteristics at a smaller scale. That's why the gold-only rule breaks in late stages. The next regime is not a pure monetary contest. It's a settlement contest tied to real production. Now, notice what markets rarely price correctly. Reserve behavior is slow, but it is never casual. When a treasury or a central bank changes its approved reserve set, that change tends to outlive administrations, cycles, and headlines. It becomes doctrine. And doctrine is built around worst-case scenarios, not base-case forecasts. The base case says trade continues and paper remains accepted. The worst case says clearing is denied and paper becomes a political instrument. Reserves are designed for the worst case. So when you hear silver, don't picture a day trader. Picture a planner asking, what can we hold that keeps value, stays liquid, and also supports industrial continuity if access is restricted? There's also a practical reason silver shows up when states think in stress scenarios: denomination. Gold is a high-value anchor, excellent for sovereign balance sheets, but it is not always the most flexible unit for day-to-day industrial trade-offs if a system fragments into smaller bilateral channels. Silver historically served as the working metal of commerce across many eras precisely because it sits between everyday exchange and high-level reserves. In a fractured environment, that middle layer becomes useful again. Another reason is signaling. When a country expands reserves beyond the single sacred asset, it communicates to insiders that the playbook has changed. It tells domestic institutions, exporters, and miners, we are building a broader collateral base, and we intend to defend settlement capacity under constraint. And then there's the paper problem. Modern markets create huge volumes of paper claims on commodities through derivatives and leveraged structures. In calm periods, paper is efficient. In stress, paper becomes a cue. Who actually gets delivery, who gets cash settlement, and who is told to wait. States watch that risk closely, because in a sanctions and controls world, being cash settled is not the same as being supplied. Physical collateral is the difference between continuity and interruption. That is why silver's dual identity matters. It is not just a monetary hedge against currency debasement. It is also a hedge against supply interruption, because the state can treat the metal as inventory insurance in the same way it treats energy reserves or strategic materials. Now connect that to the big picture. When the world transitions from globalization to block competition, the reserve question becomes, what do we hold that survives legal warfare, supports industrial continuity, and provides trade leverage? In that question, Gold is necessary, but gold alone is not sufficient for every scenario. The moment you hear the reserve set expanding, you are hearing the state admit it is preparing for multiple pathways of stress, not one. And here's the final twist. The public usually thinks reserve changes are about profit. But for states, reserves are about avoiding being forced into the worst trade of all, selling strategic assets at the bottom to buy survival at the top. So the silver signal is also a preemptive defense against future forced decisions. It is a way to say, we will not be cornered into liquidity at any price. So when Russia signals silver belongs in the state reserve toolkit, the most important interpretation is not Russia predicts higher prices. The important interpretation is Russia is preparing for a world where settlement is harder, neutrality is weaker, and industrial security matters as much as monetary optics. Check. Now take the present-day pattern and tighten it further, because the logic stacks. Stage 1, the world treated post-Cold War settlement infrastructure as a one-way global highway. Money moved, custody was respected, and reserves were assumed protected by norms. Check. Stage 2, the highway became overloaded. Debt grew, supply chains became optimized and therefore fragile, and governments made promises that required endless liquidity. The wheel kept turning because faith kept rolling it. Verified. Stage 3, the highway gained toll gates. Sanctions, restrictions, and immobilizations proved that neutral infrastructure can switch into weapon mode overnight. That is the credibility fracture. Undeniable. Stage 4, reconfiguration begins quietly. More custody at home, more emphasis on physical assets, more bilateral settlement experiments, more strategic stockpiling. And now, a reserve set that expands beyond gold-only mentality toward a broader hard collateral mindset. Check. This is why the signal matters even if you don't care about Russia. Once the precedent exists, others can adopt similar logic for their own reasons. Risk management, sanctions avoidance, industrial security, or simple distrust of unilateral control. The contagion is not ideological, it is mechanical. When the incentive structure changes, behavior spreads. And the crowd usually notices stage 4 only after prices move. But prices move because the architecture changed months earlier. By the time social media screams about shortages, the strategic allocations were already in motion. So if you want to be early, you don't chase the candle. You track the architecture, reserve composition, procurement rules, domestic refining capacity, friendly custody networks, and the language governments use when they talk about strategic materials. Now bring it back to you, because this is where most people make a fatal mistake. They treat reserves like an academic topic and treat their portfolio like a casino, even though both are driven by the same stress dynamics. When trust is high, risk assets outperform and paper claims feel safe. When trust fractures, the hierarchy flips. The market begins to pay for collateral, not optimism. That doesn't mean you panic by anything shiny. It means you stop being naive about what is being repriced. You think in layers: liquidity layer, custody layer, collateral layer, and geopolitical layer. And this is why adding silver is psychologically important. Gold only is a statement of monetary hedging. Silver is a statement of dual hedging. Monetary plus industrial optionality in a world where industry itself becomes a battlefield of leverage. If that sounds dramatic, good. The late stage always sounds dramatic right before it becomes normal. Now dismiss the comforting myths. American exceptionalism does not override refinancing math. Technology will save us does not solve custody risk. Modern optimism does not reverse the fact that we are already in a sanctions and controls era. So what do you do with this signal? You stop treating metals like memes and start treating them like system indicators. You watch what states do, not what pundits say. States don't buy reserve assets for a quick flip. They buy to reduce vulnerabilities in scenarios where normal rules don't apply. Here's the practical takeaway. Build your worldview around the 4-stage mechanism, not the narrative. Ask 4 questions every time you see a surprising move. What is the credibility anchor? Where is overextension building? What event fractured neutrality? And what hard collateral is being pulled into reserves? If you can answer those 4, you will predict the next step before the crowd sees it. One more thing, do not wait for official confirmation to take a signal seriously. In late-stage cycles, confirmation arrives after positioning is complete. The announcement is the echo, not the cause. So treat this like a systems analyst. When reserve doctrine changes, it means policymakers have already run the scenario tree and decided the probability of disruption is high enough to pay for insurance. That is the real headline. The people closest to the machinery are paying for insurance with real assets because they do not expect the next decade to be settled on trust alone. Final warning. This time is not different because the constraints are the same. Debt systems require confidence. Confidence breaks under stress. Stress is amplified by fragmentation. Fragmentation increases demand for tangible collateral. That sequence is not politics. It is mechanics. And that's why silver in state reserves is a message. The late stage is here, and the reserve rulebook is being rewritten in real time. If you want the next piece, you need to understand what comes after stage 4 starts spreading, how parallel settlement grows, how commodity collateral tightens, and how the next crisis forces the next adaptation. Subscribe now, because the next video will show how the machine was built, why it must keep tightening, and what the next checkpoint looks like when the world shifts from promises to possession.